two ways I began to track light exposure after listening to Andrew Huberman now for about a few years about light exposure. The first one is an app. This is called Light Meter. It's available on Android. The second one is a more continuous measurement. This is my watch, which is the Garmin Fenix 7S Pro. The first one, the app allows you to first of all open the app once you have it downloaded, and then you can pretty much see the lux hours. It also allows you to have a graph here and also this gauge, or I don't know what it is exactly called. You can also switch to the just lux view, which then shows you just the lux hours. Because I am inside here and I do have my studio lights on, it shows 55 lux. It also gives you a couple of information pieces about what usual environments should have and would have. So in order to show you this, I switch to the auto exposure, and now I can actually show it to you. So we have a study desk 300 to 500, living room 200 to 500, school classroom, university lecture 300 to 750, library, you can see the values. Now what is maybe to note about this is that during the day also the light intensity changes. In the night there is not much light intensity, at least naturally, so it might also make sense, as I did with my smart lights here, to include basically dimming of the lights as one wakes up, and then basically a gradual dimming towards the evening until eventually the light goes out, which I implemented with smart lights. Now the second way to measure the light exposure, because this is only available if you have your phone out. Now wouldn't it be nice if you had something like this attached to your body, maybe exactly onto your retinas, and then you would actually have the light exposure that gets into your pupil and then also hits your brain. But this is currently not really available, at least I don't know of any implementation of this. So some time ago I thought up this idea of maybe you could have an app on your smartwatch, because this already has a brightness sensor, and therefore it already would be kind of the best approximation to something like this, because your phone is something that also has a brightness sensor, and also a camera in front, but does not have this out. At this time already Garmin had implemented its solar intensity, which I then kind of found out about. So some of the Garmin watches, not all of them, have a solar ring, and the solar ring basically creates electricity by being exposed to light. Now, especially if the watch is not that dirty, then this might even work a little bit better. There seems to be also a second solar panel which is kind of beneath the display, which is not really visible, but makes this whole display kind of this somewhat reflective look, or gives it this somewhat reflective look. Now, this is the Garmin Fenix 7S Pro. On the newer 8 version of these watches, there is basically on some watches only a solar ring, and the solar ring is only on the outer layer, and it's also not this reddish any longer, but it's actually more black, or at least darker. Now this still has kind of the whole display covered, and also on the outside this solar ring. Now if I go into the watch itself, I can therefore now see a track. So first of all, one has to kind of understand, I think, the lux hours. So the lux hours are just a measure of intensity of light. If one has a measure of intensity of light similar to performance, for example, one still then needs to add, or basically have this over time, in order to then get a metric that is actually including the time variable. So first of all, in order to do this here, one could see this graph already, so this is also kind of already an introduction like this. But wouldn't it be nice if you had, maybe over the course of a given week, your light exposure at least approximated by the skin on your wrist, which since I began tracking my light exposure with this watch, I began basically to always make sure that my wrist, so ideally if I go out I have this watch on, and if I'm exposed to light indoor, it does not make that much of a difference. I also need to charge the watch every now and then. So if I now have this on me and I go out, then I make sure this wrist is usually basically not exactly targeted to the sun. I just usually wear it, which also is already kind of a deviation, because your eyes are like looking in this direction and your hand might be looking in this direction. Of course now it is just a piece of, basically a piece of skin that is exposed, and you are covering this piece of skin, and then it's only an approximation. But it is, because light intensity outside is so different from inside, it is still very noticeable. So one could then take a look at the lux hours. So basically these are lux, and if you multiply them by time, then you get lux hours. And so these are my lux hours for today, for example, where I went out a couple of hours ago, or maybe 2 hours ago. I then also can go into the weekly settings, and this has been very useful. So here we can see that the average currently is 1.3K, and the average could go as high as 20K, or at least on individual days it goes as high as 20K. Because I actually began having this watch now 1.5 years ago, so I did go through, basically I'm in the middle of summer, and I did get it in this winter, and so I am now half a year into wearing this watch, I think at least, yeah. So I basically started in winter, and then as it became more and more summer, it also began to become apparent that it is easier and easier to just get more light exposure in. On my first Garmin watch, on the 6S Pro, there was first of all no solar panel. There is also a version with solar panel, but this also did not have the synchronization with the app. So in this case, I do have the app installed, and this app now also shows me the solar intensity, even though the solar intensity does not show up as a normal Garmin metric. Also maybe because it is not exactly used. The question is also, what is light exposure? Is it skin light exposure or eye light exposure? Probably mostly the eye light exposure might be important. And it also doesn't show you any graphs, it only shows you as the light exposure as of today, which is kind of sad because, well, it would be very interesting to see, to have all the data now for the last 7 days, for the last 4 weeks, and for the last year, maybe in here, similar to heart rate and so on and so forth. But currently I only have it here, which means in order to access this, I would have to basically screenshot rolling average basically of these screens. Basically, I would at least have to screenshot it at every 7 days in order to then have the data stored somehow. I assume at least that Garmin is already storing the data and maybe preparing to develop an algorithm that basically approximates then the light exposure of the eyes with the skin. Or maybe in the future you could also think about smart glasses that just you wear approximately over your eyes, and then that also have brightness sensors and then register this light that is coming in. So these have been the two ways I began to track a light exposure. First of all, as of today, for example, I just went out and I then took a picture of the sky, such that I basically have the view of the phone. Of course, the view of the phone is not identical to what the view of my eyes would be. And actually, I took my phone and headed it upwards to the eye, and so down here, for example, it was at now summer in the late afternoon, it was 5,000 to 6,000 lux, and then up here it was 10,000 lux. If directed directly at the sun, even in the late afternoon, it was close to 100K. Now this also leads me back to the app, because in the app you can actually switch to this gauge, and this gauge also is settable, so you can set basically the max, which I did, to 100K, which is approximately how bright sunlight gets, which makes it kind of very easy to see how bright it is. Now because this app probably mostly was developed for indoor lighting measurement, it was previously set to 1.2K or something like this, so basically the brightest maybe indoor lights get. Now for reference, if you know about Brian Johnson, then you also know about his lamp maybe he has in the morning, and this has 10,000 lux, which is then about 1/10 of the maximum light exposure you would get from the sun in the morning. And in the morning you would not get the light exposure exactly the 10,000, because it is actually lower, which also is shown here in this natural light sources graph here. So direct sunlight in between 32K to 100K ambient daylight. You can read it for yourself. The full moon only has one lux, which is fairly low, I would say. And also sunset and sunrise were surprisingly low, with only 400 lux. Now, in total, it was very insightful, I think, to at least have it on my watch. I would wish to have it also on my phone, but currently this is not existing.